Hello, welcome back to another episode of Created for Christ's Word. We are back with our Young and Mighty series, continuing with our new character, Esther, that we started from the last episode. I'm not going to make this an intro too long. I'm just going to jump right into the story. Don't forget to like and share with others, and let's get started with the story. When we last talked about Esther, we saw that the King Xerxes, hosted a competition to decide who would be the next queen after kicking Queen Vashti out of the kingdom and stripping her title as queen. We saw that the king chose Esther to be his queen out of all the young girls. So now that Esther is the queen, she has to live in the king's palace. It must have been a nice, big, and beautiful place. Esther stayed in a separate room from the king. Mordecai, her cousin, still checked on her regularly to see how she was doing, and he had a job working for the king. While Mordecai was on duty near the king's gate, he saw two of the king's eunuchs or servants who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters. The eunuchs' names were Bigthan and Teresh. These two eunuchs became angry at King Xerxes, but the Bible doesn't reveal why. But in their anger, the two eunuchs plotted to assassinate the king. Mordecai overheard their plot to kill the king and immediately reports this to his cousin Queen Esther. When Esther gets the news of an assassination plan from Mordecai, she then tells the king, and she makes sure to give her cousin credit. When the king heard what the queen told him, he made an investigation to see if the story was true. And eventually the story was proved right, so the king had the two men sentenced to death by impaling them with a sharpened pole. Sometime later on, Xerxes promoted a man named Haman over all the nobles in his palace. This makes him the most powerful official in the Persian Empire. Basically, that would make him second most powerful second most powerful between him and the king. So outside of the king, he was probably the most powerful outside of the king and queen. Haman, though, was not a good person morally. Haman was cocky, arrogant, and prideful. Haman thought that he was better than everyone else in the king's palace. Whenever Haman passed by, all the king's officials bowed down before him, paying him respect. Everyone bowed down except for Mordecai. People asked why he didn't bow down before Haman, but Mordecai refused to answer why. Every time he passed by Haman tried to get him to bow down. Yet numerous times, Mordecai still refused. This filled Haman with fury. This also made Haman develop a hate for Mordecai. Haman knew of Mordecai's nationality as a Jew. After he found out Mordecai's nationality, he didn't just want to figure out a way to get rid of Mordecai. He wanted to get rid of Mordecai and the Jews. He hated Mordecai and the Jews both. He hated both of them. And he had to figure out how to get rid of them. So then he came up with a scheme. One day, Haman appeared before King Xerxes, and in Esther 8-15, here's what Haman requested before the king. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire, who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So, it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they may be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and the decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. So basically, Haman's scheme is to basically get the king to sign he schemed to get the king to sign a decree to annihilate the Jews, which would include Mordecai, on one day. And he had to get the king's approval of it, but he didn't tell him it was Haman. And mind you, Haman is the same guy who saved the king. So the king doesn't know that Mordecai is a Jew. So he just hears that there are a certain race of people. He doesn't know it's the Jews. He just said Haman just tells him there's a certain race of people who don't obey their laws, which is a lie. So he's basically lying to the king. And basically, by tricking the king allows Haman to write this law, and he approves of it. When the decree reached the Jews freaked out. They were confused as to why the king would make a decree to annihilate all the Jews in Persia. Mordecai tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth and ashes. They back then to put ashes on their head and to wear sackcloth, a type of clothing, was to represent mourning. It was a sign of mourning and grief. All the Jews wore sackcloth and ashes along with Mordecai and mourning, for they knew that soon they would die. Mordecai then realized that it was Haman. He thought to himself and realized that it might have been Haman, that it was Haman who might have convinced the king to sign the decree. In sackcloth and ashes, Mordecai went to the palace gates to see Esther. Esther saw him and wondered why he wore sackcloth in mourning. And because you don't usually wear those things unless you're grieving for someone or something. Esther asked her servant Hathach to see why her cousin was in mourning. He did as Esther said, and Mordecai explained to Hathach the king's decree for the Jews, and Hathach explained her cousin's message. Esther was shocked to hear this, but Mordecai also asked if Esther would go before the king to beg for mercy against the Jews. Now, Esther was like, she said no. And you're probably wondering, like, why couldn't she just... And she can't just go to the king and ask for mercy. You're probably wondering why. Why couldn't she go to the king to ask him a simple question? Well, back then, the laws were different, and you couldn't go to the king unless he calls for you. And the law says that unless the king calls you to him, you cannot appear uninvited to him. The penalty for that was death. Yet in Esther 4:13-17, here's what Mordecai tells Esther, and here's what Esther did in response to Mordecai's word. Because on the fence, she's saying, no, I can't go to the king. I could lose my life. No, I can't. Here's what Mordecai says. Esther 4:13-17. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. We'll talk about such a time as this later. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So he's telling her that maybe God brought her to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now we're going to stop here for today, but this story is already getting good, and we're going to see how it develops more in the next episode. And we're just going to get right into our points with number 1. There's only 2 points. Number 1, we cannot yield, bow, and surrender to the world or to people. Mordecai did not bow before Haman because to him the only person that is worthy to be worshipped was God. Haman worshipped and obeyed God. He believed and honored and respected God. And he understood the importance of his obedience and loyalty to God. And it's important because the 10 Commandments states, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And I'm not saying that by bowing the people were putting Haman as a god, but no one is to be worshipped except God. Anyone that's not God, anyone that's not God, Mordecai would not bow to. We as the young people can't let others determine whether we worship God or not. It doesn't matter whether they are in a high position or well respected. We can't let people just dictate and maybe try to intimidate us to get them to worship them. I will not bow to anyone except God. And lastly, number 2, when God chooses you to do something, it is at just the right time. And I'm going to read again, Esther 4:13. I'm going to read that part. Here it is. "Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Mordecai told Esther that maybe God put her in the title of queen for such a time as this. And Esther believed him. She understood. So where does that put us? How does such a time as this relate to us? We live in a fallen world, and Jesus is coming back quicker than we think. It seems like a while. People have been saying, you hear people all the time say, if you guys have been preaching if Jesus is coming back, then why is it taking so long? God's timing is different from our timing. What seems slow to us is actually, it may be faster to God. And what we see as something that is the right time, it's the perfect time to do this, it may not be the perfect timing for God. And we have to choose to trust his timing over our timing. God wants to use us for such a time as this. And I believe if there was ever a time that God could use us as young Christians, it would be now. Now is the right time to be used by God. This is your time. It's time for us to rise up, to spread the gospel to as many people as we can, to demonstrate the power and the glory that God has demonstrated. And it's time for us to rise up. And we need to be a last day army of God. And we have to believe that this may be our time. If God could use us at any time, it would be now. Thank you for listening to Creative for Christ's work. I pray that you will be blessed, and I will see you next time.